Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you
Hello, welcome to Self-Inflicted Oral Nostalgia, the Guided by Voices podcast, every GBV LP, every 2 weeks. Today I'll be talking about 2002's Universal Truths and Cycles. First, all music heard in this podcast is played and owned by Guided by Voices. Any reviews or materials cited are owned by their respective creators. Special thanks goes out to Jeff Warren's Guided by Voices database, which you can find at gbvdb.com. And of course, all opinions stated are my own. Subscribe to future episodes or listen to past episodes at everygbvlp.com. If you'd like to drop me a line, you can do so by sending an email to jeff@everygbvlp.com. Now let's get to the show. Hello and welcome. Now, in the last episode, we looked at 2001's Isolation Drills, the LP that ended up being GBV's final release for TVT Records. It was the second record of a 2-LP deal, and when it was done, they headed back to Matador, where they'd released 3 records in the late 90s. The band would go on to release 3 additional records for Matador before breaking up in 2004. The pair of albums GBV made for TVT were 2 of the best records the band had ever made. However, they were also among the most divisive in terms of their critical reception, not to mention among the group's fans. A lot of people, even to this day, Bob included, think that Do the Collapse is too polished, if not an outright mistake. And while Guided by Voices have never come close to selling out, this was the period when the band tried its hardest to achieve mainstream success, only to find it elusive. As I talked about in the previous episode, the band was touring more than ever. Bob was doing his best to write hit songs, and yet the records were selling more or less the same amount. It didn't help that his personal life had been turned upside down when his marriage of 2 decades collapsed. Tied to all this was the fact that Pollard really wasn't willing to jump through the hoops that were required to make it to that next level. And it seemed everyone around the band could sense the rut the band had fallen into. We just realized that we were flogging a dead horse, Bob said of his time with TVT. The attempt was to try to sell more records and to get more radio play, but that wasn't happening. He also found that, even though the contract with TVT stated that Pollard had complete creative control, he still had to make concessions. You find that when you have people that are supporting you and putting a lot of money into you, he said, you kind of have to play by their rules. Where they ended up was back with Matador Records, their previous label. As Pollard stated in a press release announcing the news, it's great to be reunited with our good friends at Matador, fellow rock geeks with the same basic philosophy on record artistry. Matador's Gerard Kosloy added, we have long regretted the interruption of their tenure with the label and are grateful this partnership will recommence. Billboard magazine characterized the return as not surprising and referred to the switch as GBV being back home at the friendly confines of Matador Records, adding that the New York-based label had lifelined the group out of years of regional obscurity in the mid-90s. I would disagree with this on a few points. First of all, it was Scat, not Matador, who discovered and broke the band. Also, GBV's obscurity was such in the 80s and early 90s that the region Billboard was referring to as Planet Earth. Guided by Voices was pretty much an unknown entity, even in their hometown. This was not a situation where a local band with a local following suddenly gets a national audience. GBV were a group who, before Scat came along in 1993, weren't playing shows and had no distribution other than a few friends who got their homemade LPs into mom-and-pop stores, where they didn't sell. Remember also that the band had broken up. 1992's Propeller was meant to be their last release, and if Robert Griffin had never called Pollard and asked to put out an EP, it quite possibly could have ended there. Second, how friendly really was Matador toward the band, or vice versa? I mean, it's obvious that Matador liked GBV and wanted them back, and Bob had long admired the label and stated that he wanted to be part of it. But pretty much all the things that led to trouble with Matador previously were still there. It's sort of like when you get back with an ex without really solving any of the things that broke you up in the first place. It'll be fun for a while, but in the end, you're headed for trouble. To start with, even back during the first go-around with Matador, they'd been concerned about the band's drinking. In Hunting Accidents, Bob talks about a meeting that the label had set up to talk about the excesses of the Mag Earwig tour. And even though Pollard had tried to rein the band in on later tours, this is still GBV we're talking about. Drinking was always going to be an issue, which Matador had to have realized. There was also the fact that Bob had no intention of having Guided by Voices be his only musical output. He was quoted at the time as saying, "Being on Matador gives me the liberty to release as many solo and side project recordings as I want." And yeah, while that was technically true, and remember that being on both Scat and TVT gave Bob the same opportunity, Matador wasn't especially happy about it. The label had put their foot down and limited Pollard to one GBV record a year. And while they'd released both Bob and Tobin's solo records, they passed and would continue to pass on the more arcane side project stuff, the same as TVT. In fact, during the second phase of being on Matador, the label only released GBV material. They didn't put out anything by Toby or Bob, even though they both continued to release solo records. And they certainly didn't put out any Circus Devils or Acid Ranch or Lifeguard records or anything else that Pollard cooked up on the side. In a 2003 New York Times article about GBV, the headline of which was "The Band That Can't Stop Recording," Kosloy called Pollard's massive musical output impressive but unwieldy. I'll talk in later episodes about what this means as a fan, but for a label head like Kosloy, this was a real headache. It meant he couldn't get as much coverage for the band or even reviews. Kosloy, bemoaning the downward spiral of GBV's album sales, which began around the time of Under the Bushes, which is to say pretty much when they first signed to the label, declared, "Part of that is due to the volume of Guided by Voices related products." So to my mind, going back to Matador seems a bit weird. The band was still the band and Matador was still Matador. Neither had really changed in terms of how they functioned or what they expected. The seeds of the end were right there at the beginning. So why did either side think that the results would be different than they'd been the first time around? And it's not like they didn't have choices. At the time, GBV were talking to several independent labels, including Vagrant and Sub Pop. To my ears, Guided by Voices signing to Sub Pop sounds absolutely right. Remember that Bob had been influenced by grunge on The Same Place the Fly Got Smashed. Plus, the band's whole loud rock and roll thing fits in pretty much perfectly on the Seattle label. However, when his manager told him that Matador was also interested, Bob instantly thought, wow, we've got to go back. So they did. And speaking of loud rock and roll, around the time Universal Truths was made, there was a return to the guitar-based rock sound that was GBV's bread and butter. This rock revival was led by the White Stripes and the Strokes, but also featured groups like the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, the Vines, and the Hives. Suddenly, playing guitar and being loud was fashionable again. Even Radiohead, who'd largely eschewed guitars around the turn of the century, focusing instead on Warp Records' Atmospherics, released a more guitar-based LP around this time, 2003's Hail to the Thief. Another thing these bands had in common was their youth. These were young kids, barely out of their teens. GBV had always been the odd group out due to their age. Remember that they were seen as old even when they burst onto the scene 10 years before, so by this point they were seen as elder statesmen. And that was okay, since a number of these bands, including arguably the most important group of the scene, the Strokes, name-checked GBV and said what an influence they'd been on their sound. Bob had now achieved yet another milestone in his artistic achievements. He'd lasted long enough to influence a new generation. His musical fandom had come full circle, since he was having an impact on bands the way the bands he'd loved growing up, Genesis, The Who, King Crimson, had had an impact on him. When you're younger, said Strokes guitarist Albert Hammond Jr., you have your older idols. GBV were like my modern idols who made me feel like I could do it. Bob loved the attention and even boasted that he'd discovered the Strokes. The band had thrown their demo on stage during a GBV show, and GBV actually listened to it on the ride to their next concert. They liked what they heard and invited the band to open up for them on a string of shows. After that, they went over to England, Bob said, and all of a sudden they were the biggest thing on earth. The relationship between the two bands lasted longer than just that initial string of dates. The Strokes and GBV played a pair of sold-out shows at New York's famed Apollo Theater, including one on New Year's Eve. The Strokes even joined GBV on stage for, as Rolling Stone described it, a boozy encore of My Valuable Hunting Knife. The Strokes would later return the favor, bringing Pollard on stage at Reading to play A Salty Salute. The Strokes even put GBV in the video for their song, Someday, squaring off against the band in the game show Family Feud. Pollard described the Strokes as his best buddies, and for a while it seems they were. What's interesting to me is that the band didn't just look to GBV for musical inspiration. The group also, whether consciously or unconsciously, followed the trajectory of GBV. Similar to Guided by Voices, the Strokes were mining a loud rock sound that was hailed as a return to basics. They had a great backstory and a clutch of really strong singles. Plus, they drank a lot. And yet, despite all the early attention and glowing press, the Strokes never really had a hit and never sold as many records as their contemporaries. In fact, bands who were sort of considered to be Strokes light like Kings of Leon and The Killers went on to have huge success, while the Strokes, for all their accolades and press coverage, remained, a lot like their heroes GBVs, not much more than a cult band. As Pitchfork wrote, when they took a look back at the Strokes' debut record, Is This It?, a decade after its release, despite the album's non-radio-friendly production, the initial burst of excitement around its release created high hopes. However, as Pitchfork continues, even though Is This It exceeded expectations in England, it stalled out in the US. That could also apply to Alien Lanes. Why did this happen? Because, similar to Pollard, they just didn't play the game. They didn't release the right songs as singles, make palatable videos, and didn't capitalize on opportunities when they were presented. The band had to be begged to go on tour or be on MTV, but they just didn't care. Similar to Pollard, they just didn't give a fuck. However, the polar opposite to Bob, they had their looks, fame, and family names to fall back on. While Pollard was eking out a small salary teaching elementary school in Ohio, some of the Strokes were attending private school in Switzerland. Their families were loaded, they were young and good looking. They were going to be okay no matter what happened. Bob, by contrast, I would argue, was taking real risks when he insisted on doing things his way. Now that GBV was free from TVT, their first major decision was not to go with a big-name producer. They felt they could do this because they'd learned enough from the two prior LPs in terms of working in big studios. Plus, they wanted to stay in Ohio where they're more comfortable and so they could keep costs down. However, they felt they needed a bit of help and so drafted in Todd Tobias, the brother of bass player Tim Tobias. As Bob said, he's really good. We tell him what we want to do and he helps us get it. Todd was, of course, the musical mastermind behind side project Circus Devils, which was just getting started around this time. The way that group worked was that Todd, an accomplished multi-instrumentalist, would create all the music and send it to Pollard, who would then put down vocals over the tracks. The music Tobias provided was often raw, weird, and angular, sounding like early Devo. Bob's strange and fantastical lyrics were often the perfect accompaniment to Todd's left-field backing tracks. For example, here's a bit of Buffalo Spiders from the first Circus Devils record, Ringworm Interiors, which came out in 2001. It's safe to say that the Pollard, who'd hoped to achieve some sort of mainstream acceptance and a wider audience for his work, didn't have that in mind when embarking on the journey he'd take with Circus Devils over the next decade and a half. Tobias ended up doing such a good job on Universal Truths that he stuck around for the next 2 GBV records, not to mention he'd go on to produce a bunch of really fine Pollard solo records. However, at the time of this LP, Todd's experience was mainly on a 4-track, so he said that it was kind of crazy that he was asked to produce the record and that doing so was a trial by fire. Joining them in the studio at the departure of drummer Jim McPherson was John McCann. Otherwise, the rest of the lineup was the same from the last LP, Doug Gillard and Nate Farley on guitar, and Todd's brother Tim on bass. McCann had gotten to know the band when his previous group, American Flag, opened up for GBV. He later started his own band along with his brother Chris called Nassau, putting out 2 records in the aughts. However, his time in GBV didn't last long. This is the only album he's involved with. He later said of this period, "It was a great time, with too many highlights to recall, but eventually all that time spent on the road got to feel a lot like work." As usual, the original idea for the record changed and balloons from Pollard's original vision. "I intended to make a proper 12-song album because we haven't done that, just 12 songs. So we did that, finished it and mixed it, and then I wrote a bunch of new songs." The new songs Bob had written were, as he describes them, kind of punk songs and pop songs. Not to mention they were shorter than the longer tracks he'd intended for the 12-track LP. While originally intending to place these new tracks on a solo record, Pollard instead went the Alien Lanes route and sprinkled these shorter songs among the longer ones, as he put it, kind of like an old GBV album. And while I think that Universal Truths and Cycles is a really solid record, I think that its main flaw is exactly what Pollard describes. He just can't seem to resist overstuffing LPs and throwing on song after song. The short songs added to truths, to my ears, often detract more than they add, getting in the way of some really amazing tracks. If he'd indeed kept it at a tight dozen songs, this LP would be a classic. In terms of titles, he considered From a Voice Plantation, All Sinners Welcome, Invisible Train to Earth, and Panic Revolution. The eventual title, Universal Truths and Cycles, was chosen because, according to Bob, it's more applicable to the way the album feels. It's about daily struggle, daily existence, car rage, riding on a subway, and all that. It's about the things that everybody goes through daily. You're reborn every morning, and you get a new chance to get your shit together. Being back on Matador meant that Pollard once again not only had more say over the music, but also the design of his records. This meant collaborating once again with in-house Matador designer Mark O. As Bob says, on our last 2 records with TVT, they did not let me do the album covers, and I don't like those covers. They came up with the ideas and we accepted them, but they don't look half as good as the covers I do. The cover that Mark and Bob came up with is really nice and stands out among the dozens of other GBV sleeves. It's also the only one where the material it's made out of, a heavy cardstock with a rough texture, is part of the overall design and desired effect. Plus, using V's for U's in the band and album's name to match the Roman-inspired image of a man fighting a lion is a nice touch. Speaking of, whenever I see V's used instead of U's like this, it reminds me of that scene in Mel Brooks's History of the World Part 1, where a character, in a scene in ancient Rome, says to another character, "You're nuts, NVTS nuts." The album spawned 2 Matador-backed CD singles, Back to the Lake and Everywhere with Helicopter, with Pollard's Fading Captain series putting out the 7-inch versions. Fading Captain also issued 2 more singles on vinyl for the songs Cheyenne and title track Universal Truths and Cycles. The singles were released in 2-week increments starting that May and leading up to the release of the record in June in order to drum up interest in the new LP. Matador also made a video for Everywhere with Helicopter. Shot at New Jersey's Six Flags Great Adventure amusement park, it shows Bob singing the song while riding various roller coasters, interspersed with scenes of 4 kids walking around and enjoying the park. It's a really fun video, especially when Pollard goofs around with the kids and eats burgers, fries, and cotton candy. After so many tales of Bob's drunken antics, it's sweet to see him play the family man. The only bad thing is that this is when Pollard was still coloring his hair, plus his hair is pretty short, so it's not his best look. To celebrate the release of Universal Truths, GBV played a packed in-store at Amoeba Records in Los Angeles. While in California, they also appeared on TV show The Late Late Show with Craig Kilborn performing Everywhere with Helicopter. And to show what a force the web was becoming by this point, the band also filmed an interview for AOL, and Matador streamed the album on their website via a customized flash player, if you remember those. All the promotional activities paid off, with the album peaking at 160 on the Billboard Top 200, the band's highest ever position. Reviews for the LP were mostly positive. Giving the record a 7.6, Pitchfork wrote, "To make a long story short, it's the best thing Pollard's done since Mag Earwig." However, after acknowledging a few of the record's classic tracks, such as Cheyenne, the reviewer makes note of the LP's short song snippets, writing, "Yet other songs, like the minute-long The Ids Are Alright and Factory of Raw Essentials, meander in typical Pollard fashion without ever really registering." The review also makes mention of GBV's failed attempt to break into the mainstream, noting that whatever hopes Pollard might have had of bringing his sweet rock and roll to the masses had been crushed, trampled, and stomped into the ground. The bits there about being crushed and trampled are a reference, made in very poor taste, I would add, to a tragedy that happened in Cincinnati in 1979. At a sold-out Who concert at Riverfront Coliseum, 11 people were crushed to death, and 26 others suffered injuries when the overly enthusiastic crowd rushed through the doors. The band weren't told about the tragedy until after the concert, which went on as planned. Pollard was actually at this show, and in an era before cell phones and Facebook safety check, there was a period where his family didn't know if he was dead or alive. Apparently, Pitchfork thinks this is funny. Maybe when some of their readers get crushed at Coachella, they'll see things differently. Anyway, history came full circle in 2006 when Pollard, as a solo act, opened up for Pearl Jam at Riverfront Coliseum, by then known as the US Bank Arena. He even joined the band on stage to play Baba O'Riley in what has to be one of the ultimate tributes to his all-time heroes. There's footage of this on YouTube, and it's a joy to watch, especially when Eddie Vedder says that Pollard's a big man singing a big song. A recording of Pollard's performance that night was also released on Merge as the live LP Moon. The AV Club, in their review of Universal Truths, also cites Bob's musical output, writing that Pollard churned out so many footnotes under his Fading Captain series aegis that even the most devoted fan would hard it find to keep track of them all, much less remember which one housed the gems among the clutter. The review also makes mention of Bob and the band's resignation with its cult status, writing, Pollard now seems less interested in converting the world population into Guided by Voices fans than in furthering his own vision of what rock and roll should sound like. Rolling Stone, in a 3-star review, also couldn't help but take notice of just how much stuff Pollard was releasing. Just like the 1960s British invasion that unleashed records at a breakneck speed until Americans were drowning in vinyl, Guided by Voices leader Robert Pollard is determined to oversaturate the market all by himself. When magazines start reviewing the amount of your output instead of the quality, that's not a good sign. And just for the record, the year Universal Truths came out, Bob also issued a Circus Devils record, an EP of B-sides, a collaborative record with Mac from Superchunk under the name Go Back Snowball, an Airport 5 record with Tobin Sprout, 4 GBV singles, a full-length Guided by Voices record, and whatever the hell that was that he made with Richard Meltzer. Critics were right to wonder if Pollard was spreading himself too thin. Anyway, let's now dig into the LP track by track. The record opens with Wire Greyhounds.
My tongue to move slow, a minute before the evil sleep. Breath woman captures the ghost, blurring sweat heads.
We're back in Alien Lane's territory with this super short song snippet, which lasts for just 35 seconds. It also contains Bob's most over-the-top English accent ever. I'm not a big fan of these short sort of fragments, especially as the start to what's actually a really good and mature record, so it doesn't feel like a good lead-off track to me. But it doesn't last long before we're into the second song, Skin Parade.
For Christ's sakes, Charlie, send them your love. Pictures from happier times.
This song starts off similar to the first song, like one of the band's lo-fi songs from the early 90s. Bob's singing over an out-of-tune acoustic guitar with room noises behind him, including laughter, conversation, and bottles clinking. But that portion's just another snippet. Once the song kicks in, as a full band rocker, it sounds really good. There's also a constant sort of pounding or noise in the background that, along with the way the voices are recorded, tie it to Pollard's Circus Devils side project. The lyrics, to my mind anyway, don't seem to be about any discernible subject. The soul bearing of the previous LP, Isolation Drills, are so far in short supply on this record. Third song is Zap. This is a really nice acoustic song, harkening back to something like Paper Girl from Same Place the Fly Got Smashed. Bob's voice sounds great, and there are some nice melodic turns of phrase. The lyrics show Bob at his most mature asking, is it good for you to ask for assistance, and to ask for it for others also? It's a far cry from, I wish I could give a shit, just a little bit. However, the song's a bit short at not much more than a minute, so it feels like yet another song fragment. Next up is the brilliantly named Christian Animation Torch Carriers.
Sometimes her mother will work with her, but there's nothing wrong with her. There's nothing wrong with her.
This is an absolutely solid track that finally, 4 songs in, kicks off the record in proper fashion. That being said, it has a spare intro that lasts a minute before the song really gets going. But once it finally does, it sounds amazing. Todd Tobias does a great job producing the group, and Doug Gillard's guitar playing is absolutely spot on. By this record, he's proved himself to be absolutely indispensable to the group's sound. At 3 minutes in, when the song's title makes its appearance, the track goes into total overdrive and it's just glorious. The lyrics don't have a ton of meaning for me, but I appreciate that they don't really scan as lyrics. It's just poetry. Bob writing, never can touch their sign language. So is the cost of sound barriers. Even as though she's still searching for a cloud with a silver lining, we pray for her. She's burning slow out on a mission's light. The mention of Christians in this song, as well as the album's Roman-inspired cover art, makes me wonder whether Paul is referring to ancient history rather than recent events with this song. The Romans had, of course, banned Christianity, and Christians were persecuted for decades, sometimes being fed to lions or having to, like the illustration on the front of Universal Truths, fight for their lives against wild and dangerous animals. That being said, the whole idea of Romans screaming Christians to the lions is more likely than not overblown and was a later creation of the Christians who were eager to cast their ancestors as martyrs. Take, for example, the image of Christians fighting and dying in the Roman Colosseum. Historians now argue that it's far from certain that any Christians were put to death in the Colosseum, with two historians telling the Daily Mail that there are no records showing Christians were killed in the ancient amphitheater. That's not to say that the Romans didn't sentence people to death. Website The Conversation, in an article entitled Myth-Busting Ancient Rome, Throwing Christians to the Lions, wrote that being condemned to the beasts was a particularly grisly end. It meant that you and your companions would be exposed in the arena to a variety of wild and ferocious animals, such as leopards, boars, and yes, lions, and required to fight for your lives. This was, they write, one part of a day-long festival of violence and slaughter. So then, it was basically their version of Lollapalooza. However, the same as crucifixion, all sorts of people were condemned to die this way. This punishment was not reserved for just Christians. And in terms of being killed by a lion, execution of this sort were, according to the article, only issued on specific occasions in the 3rd and early 4th centuries AD. The next track is Cheyenne.
Shine, face of pride, never die. Shine, through blue water. Shine, celebrate for you and I. Sifting through the pieces of the broken prize.
This is another absolutely gorgeous track featuring some really amazing vocals by Bob. As I've said before, he can be a classic hard rock singer a la Roger Daltrey, but his ability to hit some pretty high notes here shows his vocal range. In fact, speaking of Daltrey, the whole swinging vibe of the song makes me think of all the amazing pop songs that came out of the British invasion. However, since this song is called Cheyenne, his lyrical inspiration was probably provided closer to home. Cheyenne is the capital of Wyoming, and according to Wikipedia, it was named for the American Indian Cheyenne tribe, one of the most famous and prominent Great Plains tribes closely allied with the Arapaho. Cheyenne was also the name of a TV series that ran during Bob's childhood. It's also sometimes a girl's name. The production on this song is just great, and it features more amazing guitar work by Doug Gillard, with him turning in probably my favorite GBV guitar solo ever. John McCann also does a great job on the drums. Pitchfork cited this as the record's standout track, writing, built around a lovely chord progression and developing towards an endlessly catching finale, Cheyenne could easily be the most blissful Guided by Voices song since Waved Out's Subspace Biographies. The fact that Waved Out was a Pollard solo record and not a GBV LP shows that, with so much Bob-related merchandise available, it was hard to keep track of what song went with what project. Next track is The Weeping Bogeyman.
Naked comes alive in my private glass tent, oh yeah.
This is a short acoustic song with some atmospheric production by Tobias. It's a bit meandering and doesn't seem to have much of a point, but a few melodic turns of phrase late in the song make it a nice listen. The next song is Back to the Lake.
How can I look through their senseless sight as much as I'd like to?
This is another super strong song. The start-stop of the guitars means that it's heavy, but not just a constant barrage. Everyone sounds just amazing, and even though it's fairly short, at a few seconds past the 2.5-minute mark, it feels like a totally fleshed out song. I'll take the lyrics at face value and assume they're about Pollard trying to reach someone who just won't answer their phone or pick up, something used to have to do when phones had two pieces and usually rested on tabletops. Plus, Ohio has about 50,000 lakes, so I'm sure Daytonians, the same as everyone else in the state, spend a fair time visiting lakes for vacations. When asked by Spin Magazine in 2004 to rank his top 10 GBV songs, he put this song at number 6. Next track is Love 1. This half-baked track, at under a minute long, was most likely one of the ones Pollard added at the last minute. Why he didn't just stick this on a solo LP or one of the suitcases is beyond me. Anyway, it's not a good song, although it's fun to hear Bob say creme brulee. Second to last song on side 1 is Storm Vibrations.
Does she blend well? Your choice, I mean. Your angel baby.
At a second shy of 5 minutes, this is the record's longest track. It starts with arpeggiated electric guitar and sounds a lot like a slightly faster Behind Blue Eyes. However, the song quickly expands and turns into a full-blown rocker that sounds really great. And when Pollard repeats, "Does it hurt you to love, I mean?" he's getting back to the emotion-laden songs on the previous LP, Isolation Drills. The song also has the repeated refrain of, "It will try to find you no matter where you may go. It will try to find you no matter who you may know." Pollard might still be talking about love here, but I think he's actually talking about death. As he said before in songs such as Exit Flagger, there's no escaping it. Death will always find you. And, of course, death is one of the ways that love ends up hurting. When you lose someone close to you, it feels like you're losing a piece of yourself. It's one of the most painful things you can experience. As the poet and undertaker Thomas Lynch writes, "Grief is the price we pay for being close to one another. If we want to avoid our grief, we simply avoid each other." We don't want to feel grief, but we want to feel love. These could be the confusing emotions Pollard references in the song. It's a truly monumental track that's only made even more epic by ending with the sound of a jet engine roaring by. It's a really grand statement and would be a great way to end the side, except there's one more song, Factory of Raw Essentials.
Circular beast exhibit. Factory of raw essentials.
This short acoustic song is okay, even though it starts with a really bad vocal by Bob, with him practically slurring the words circular beast exhibit. That being said, by the end it sounds really nice. Of all the short songs on the record, this is probably my favorite. The song was played live quite often on the tour supporting the record. The band even played it during their Amoeba Records in-store when the LP came out. There's a clip of this on YouTube which is pretty fun to watch, since Pollard asks the crowd at the beginning whether they found any good albums before telling them that he has, and pointing to the wall and saying that's where they can find the best shit. And the phrase, Factory of Raw Essentials, is still in use today. You can see it at the top of the Rockathon website. Side 2 kicks off with Everywhere with Helicopter. This is just another totally amazing track. Pollard showing that despite some ups and downs for the band, label changes and varying lineups, that GBV could still deliver really powerful songs. Again, the band's firing on all cylinders here, and Todd Tobias does a great job with the production. I also just love Bob singing on this. Pollard has an incredibly versatile voice, and I'm always impressed when he finds an interesting way to use it. For example, I'm a huge Lou Reed fan, but the guy sang pretty much the same way for decades. The NME, when reviewing this as a single, wrote, "Everywhere with Helicopter is another mysterious GBV hieroglyph, an ectoplasmic smudge of a song sticky with Pollard's McCartney-esque keen and channeling psych-pop attitude. American rock would be immeasurably poorer without Guided by Voices. If you haven't already tuned in, it's time to drop by." There are some nice cover versions of this song, including Jason Isbell's acoustic version from the Sing for Your Meat tribute record. Not to mention there's a version, which you can find on YouTube, of a children's choir singing this song. It's the Shine Children's Choir, based out of Portland, which bills itself as an independent, secular, contemporary children's chorus. The second song on side 2 is Pretty Bombs.
Climbing up to reach you, and all the suns that shine above you. Pretty bombs will sing you.
This is a really nice song that features strings and a Beatles-esque interlude towards the end. The last minute is just pure music, and it highlights what a strong band Bob had put together. Third song on side 2 is Eureka Signs.
You tell me you've come to your senses. The coast is still inside. Eureka signs, I'm slowing down. You have me.
This is a really powerful song, which is just about the closest that GBV ever got to sounding like The Who circa 1971. Like, for the first line, instead of singing, "You tell me you've come to your senses," sing, "I'd gladly lose me to find you." The lyrics again hint at some of the unrest that was all over Isolation Drills. Pollard writing, "Every day it's the god-awful same. I want to go solo and drive." Next song is Wings of Thorn. This mainly acoustic song is okay. It doesn't seem to be about anything, and at just over 2 minutes, it's over pretty fast. Next song is Car Language.
See the meaning of driving, and the driver insists that you buckle up.
At 4 minutes and 44 seconds, this is the second longest song on the record. It's kind of a weird song. The drums don't kick in for 2 minutes, and even when they do, there's no real beat. It's just the kind of pounding that was all over Vampire on Titus. In fact, it feels like a song from that album, only recorded better. The lyrics seem like they could be right out of J.G. Ballard's infamous novel Crash, with Bob writing about the wild joy of traffic, flashing metal interaction, and autoerotic satisfaction. The next song is From a Voice Plantation. This is another song that doesn't really go anywhere. There are a bunch of weird guitar noises and lyrics about smoke rings, ghosts, and onion fields. It's another real so-so song, bringing the momentum created from the first couple of songs to pretty much a standstill. Third song from the end is The Ids Are All Right.
How did I get to know ya? How could I not? All the time linking crimes in progress with previous.
This acoustic song starts with a melodica, which I think is the first time that instrument had been used on a GBV song. It's a short track and not much more than a minute long. The title contains 2 references, the first being The Kids Are All Right, the Who song that appeared on their first record, 1965's My Generation. It was released as a single, and even though it wasn't a hit, it peaked at 41 in the charts. It became one of the group's best known and most loved songs. It also provided the name for the 1979 documentary about the group made by Who superfan Jeff Stein. Speaking of, it's really time that GBV had another documentary, don't you think? And, of course, the id is one of the 3 parts of the psyche that Freud identified, along with the ego and superego. According to the website simplepsychology.com, the id is the primitive and instinctual part of the mind that contains sexual and aggressive drives and hidden memories. The superego operates as a moral conscience, and the ego is the realistic part that mediates between the desires of the id and the superego. However, I don't see much connection in the lyrics to these ideas. In fact, the final line of "all things happen" makes me think of Carl Jung's idea of synchronicity. That's a lot to pack into a minute, but they do. Second to last song is the LP's title track, Universal Truths and Cycles.
Hierarchy of land and landowners, and down we'll go back up forevermore.
I mentioned Morrissey in the last episode, and Pollard does have something in common with him, and that neither of their song lyrics really scan as song lyrics. This song is a great example of how Bob resists simple Moon-June kind of structures, writing, "We know this and that, the romantic soul for us, and the lost hierarchy of land and landowners, and down we'll go back up. Forevermore I must try to believe this." I don't have a comparative literature degree, so I won't try to unpack that. I'll just leave it there and say that I appreciate that Pollard delivers pop song lyrics that don't really sound or read at all like pop song lyrics. Musically, it's a nice song, a sort of mid-tempo tune that Pollard and the band played on this tour but never again. It hasn't been played since 2002. Recording-wise, Bob, similar to his hero John Lennon, double-tracked his vocal, and it sounds really good. I wish he did that more. Final song is Father Sergeant Christmas Card, which is, I would say, the second best title on the record after Christian Animation Torch Carriers.
Fight me in practice. Up from the squelch. A 10-point power.
This starts off as very lo-fi, with Bob returning to the English accent found on the first song, Wire Greyhounds. But then the band kicks in and the song gets fleshed out. The last 30 seconds of the track, and thus the record, consists of Bob repeating, "Oh God bless you." Whether this is a sincere religious declaration or someone in the studio just sneezed, I don't know, but it's a touching way to end the LP. Okay, that's it for the show. In the next episode, I'll be looking at 2003's Earthquake Glue. It'll be off the Richter scale. Until then, subscribe to the show, leave a review, and God bless the Monument Club.
Diss on the sex list.